So I am now going to attempt to share that. So hopefully you can all see the PowerPoint there. Do shout if you can. Okay, data everywhere, channeling the rhyme of the ancient mariner, perhaps a fairly predictable start for some of this. So listen, yeah, okay, 30 years in 30 plus years in data. I spend a lot of my time thinking about data. And although, you know, there's always the thing about being right at the coalface, right in the weeds of data, I think it's really helpful for a conversation like this to kind of just step back and think perhaps about some of the bigger questions. I've spent many years working around data definitions. I'll be running a webinar next week about the word course. And so I kind of want to start off with thinking about the definition of the word data. You know, perhaps that might seem a bit of a strange place to start, perhaps a bit of an obvious place to start. But I think, you know, to have this conversation about driving value from data, about you know, thinking about how we can improve our relationship with data, you know, what actually is data. We often think of data as a science, don't we? You know, it's kind of mathematics and computers. So it's all kind of, you know, science and technology based. There is a school of thought that says data is an art, and the interpretation of data is you know, something actually a lot softer, and you get over that science thing and you get into the other thing. There are some people who believe that data is actually magic, largely because it does things that they don't fully understand and sometimes struggle to believe. There is a school of thought that thinks that actually data is one of the most valuable assets you can hold, and data is therefore it's therefore like gold. There are people who think that data is power. Knowledge is power. If you control the data, if you control the knowledge, then you know that you can be in control of stuff. You know, regulators and so on. And you know, there are even people who think that, you know, it's just fairy dust. Just do the data and everything will be fine. And you know, there's logic and rationale in all of these things, I think. But I want to start with a definition of data, which is perhaps far less exciting than some of those. But actually, data is something to describe the world. We use data to describe the world, don't we? And so, you know, my starting point for this conversation is to think about data in the context of what we are actually describing here. And so, is data any good at describing the world? Well, what is the world like? The world, I think, is incredibly complex. You know, I'm still every day learning something about higher education and its incredible complexity. The world is universal. You know, the world covers everything. There's no boundary to the world. The world is fluid. It's continually changing. It's dynamic. It changes in different directions, different speeds, different times, and often in very unpredictable ways. You know, the world is amazing. So that's kind of what the world is like. Compared to that, what is data like? Data is actually really simple. Now, admittedly, you know, colleagues who are struggling with some of the statutory data returns we have to do might take issue with that assertion, but actually data simplifies things. It really does simplify things, and it actually likes to put things into nice, neat little boxes, doesn't it? And it sometimes takes very complex concepts and ideas and attributes and says, actually, well, it's either one of these or it's one of these. There's an awful lot of simplification that goes on. Obviously, the scope of data is limited. You know, we have data sets that describe a thing, an event, an activity, a life cycle, whatever. And there's a sense in which it's fixed. It's fixed. You know, the specification of it is fixed. Once we've defined what our data is going to be like, we've kind of fixed that. And there is obviously an element of planning, isn't there? Because the data that we end up with largely depends on the data structures that we planned any number of years ago when we put our systems and business processes together. And so I think, whichever way you think about the world, I think data actually is not very good at describing it. It's very limited. It's something that misses an awful lot, and therefore our starting point for driving value from data is the acceptance that actually data that has immense limitations. The second thing I kind of want to go on to is actually largely driven by this fellow. If you've heard me speak before, I think at every presentation somebody should mention Moore's law. So this is Gordon Moore, rest his soul. He passed away recently. Gordon Moore in 1962, 1963 made an observation that the number of transistors you can put on a slice of silicon doubles every couple of years. He said, and I quote, "I see no reason for that trend not to continue." Okay, no reason for it not to continue. It's a double negative. It's a really mealy-mouthed statement, right? He wasn't really putting his neck out when he said that, but the idea that the number of transistors you can put on a slice of silicon doubles every couple of years has basically held true for the last 60 or so years. By the early 70s, his rather mealy-mouthed assertion had become known as Moore's law. And so we largely live with that today. The number of transistors you can put on a slice of silicon doubles every couple of years. A lot of people have got onto the bandwagon with this and have created their own laws. So the amount of data that you can shove down a bit of fiber optic, that has doubled every couple of years. The amount of brightness that you can get out of LEDs for the screens that we're looking at, that has doubled every couple of years. The amount of computations you can do for every joule of energy that you put into a processor, that has doubled every couple of years. Whichever way you look at it, we are faced with an exponential growth in the power of information technology. And that has done, I think, some quite interesting things to us and the way we think about data, driven largely by an IT industry that forever wants to sell us the latest thing, the most powerful thing. And I think this has done really quite interesting things to the expectations of the value that we can get out of this stuff. Actually, you're very kind. I started working in the 1980s, and I started work doing data, and I started work actually doing business statistics. And there is the idea that actually statistics takes data and turns it into something of greater value. In the 1990s, we got tremendously excited because business statistics were considered a bit old hat, and we actually started doing management information, because information, well, that's better than statistics, isn't it? It's actually information. It's something with some meaning to it, and we all want that. We want more value. The IT industry, fueled by Moore's law, developed more fabulous stuff and said, actually, management information, that's a bit so-so. By the 2000s, we were doing business intelligence because, crikey, intelligence is much better than information, isn't it? We all want a bit of that. Nowadays, I don't think many people are talking about business intelligence. If you look at the jobs market, everyone is talking about actually wanting insight out of data. Wow, that's kind of deep. That's kind of meaningful. That's better than intelligence. If you look at a higher education regulator in England, they describe their data analysis activities in terms of foresight. I mean, for God's sake, this is not just insight. This is predictive insight, isn't it? Foresight. This is forward-looking. This is data analysis and tea leaves. And so, what we expect from our data increases, I would argue, perhaps exponentially. I have no data to back that up, but it increases. It's increased massively over the last 30 or so years. We used to do data and statistics. Now we all want insight and foresight. And if you think of the technology, well, of course we should be able to do that, because Moore's law and all those other things, the power of the technology is doubling every couple of years. However, it involves us. It involves human beings. It involves us doing things. And Moore's law does not apply to us. So we, people, and when we come together as groups and create organizations, Moore's law does not apply to those things. So we are the drag. We are the drag effect on this. And so kind of my first big conclusion out of this is that whatever the technology is doing and whatever rate of growth and power we're seeing in the technology, and therefore the expectations that we have from data, the reality is that we, people and organizations, we are holding it back. And so if we want to unlock value, it's not about technology, it's not about data, it's about people and organizations, because we are the thing that's holding it back. I spent a few years working as a consultant, and when I was a consultant, I learned basically you only ever really need to do two things. You either do a 4-box model or you do a life cycle analysis. I thought a life cycle analysis was probably the most appropriate thing to do today, because I couldn't really think of a 4-box model that would work. So I thought about, the data life cycle. We've talked about data as being something that represents the real world. So my starting point is that we start off with the real world. We analyze the real world, business analysis. We say, what does the real world look like? What are the entities? What are the relationships between these entities? What are the attributes of these entities? And all of a sudden you have a data model. You have a data model that attempts to describe the world. It's very simple, it's very static, we've talked about that, but we kind of end up with that data view of the world. Okay, we then put that into a system, we operate whatever business processes we need to around that system, and we end up, ladies and gentlemen, with data. Okay, that's where we end up with. So that's the data life cycle, and that's kind of what we go through every day in our work. So if we then map those ideas of the value expectations against that and map that up the other side of the screen, we want statistics, we want information, we want intelligence, insight, and we want foresight. I think there is an interesting parallel to some of this, and actually the way that we can think about how we can climb the ladder of value, up through information, intelligence, insight, and foresight, and by thinking about actually how far back into the data life cycle we really need to go. I would suggest that to actually get to the higher levels of insight and foresight from data, you really need to understand the real world. It is not enough to just take a data set, bung it in Excel or whatever you're using, and just looking at the data. Looking at the data will give you statistics, but it won't give you anything beyond that. To drive value out of the data, you have to understand the real world. You have to understand how that real world has then been represented in the data model. And there's going to be a lot of shoehorning and compromises and simplification in that. You have to understand how the systems and business processes then convert and capture the real world and put it into that data, so that then you can actually get a lot of value out of data. And I think there are big issues. I think there's big issues in higher education, and at the risk of being appearing a little bit obsessed by this, think about the way higher education is regulated, and the extent to which it's driven by metrics, and the people who are making judgments based on those metrics. To what extent do they actually understand the detail and the nuance of the real world that is being represented in each of those institutions, and to what extent do they understand the data journey that has been undertaken from the real world through those data returns and into their database and their regulatory metrics. And so I think there are big issues for us all, both within institutions, but also in terms of the sort of conversations we have with our funders and regulators. There's been an awful lot. Written and spoken in recent years around governance of data, and there's an awful lot actually about governance of data as an asset. This is a key part, I think, of organisational culture, the idea that you have to think of your data as an asset, something that is valuable. Yes, that idea that data is gold, it is very valuable, and therefore, there are now well accepted models emerging around the idea of data ownership, data stewardship, clearly defined roles, clearly defined points of authority and accountability, and risk and issue management. And governance will look at that across different dimensions: security, compliance, data quality, and so on. And in many organizations now, we are standing up data governance frameworks and thinking about bringing these different dimensions, security, compliance, data quality, and so on, together with clearly defined points of data ownership and authority and accountability. And that's all good. I mean, that's all good stuff. I don't want to downplay that at all. But there is, I think, another angle on the governance question. So I think I kind of just want to finish up by thinking about some of this. And it's that idea of governance, of processing and analysis. And so it's not data as an asset, as a thing, which actually implies something a bit static about it. This is about taking data as in terms of that journey, and actually that journey up the value chain, isn't it? How much value we want to drive from data. I think, and I'm going to make a big sweeping assertion here, I think in many cases this is largely non-existent. And I think there have been some really big failures, some fairly high-profile failures as a result of absent or inappropriate governance of processing and analysis. I would cite, colleagues working in higher education in England. You might recall a couple of years ago the case where the Office for Students was taken to court by Bloomsbury Institute. Bloomsbury Institute was not allowed onto the OFS register because of some decision that had been based on some metric that the OFS had calculated. And Bloomsbury Institute made the case that actually there were critical decisions being taken in the detail of those metric algorithms that were disconnected from the policy objectives. And they won the case. They won the case, right? They did not have the feedback loop and the read-through from the high-level policy through to the detail information. The other one that I guess you'll all be familiar with, the exam grades fiasco of 2020. I ended up being involved in the review that was commissioned by the Welsh Government looking at this, and what we found was actually a very similar thing. There was a whole load of stuff being done at a detailed level in the weeds of the algorithms, and there was a disconnect between that and the high-level policy objectives. As an aside, I mean, that whole exam grades fiasco, there was a faith placed in the power of data and algorithms that actually the data and algorithms could not deliver against. The idea that somehow an algorithm would get a better grade for a student than the teacher who knew the student. Well, of course that's nonsense, but you can say that now with hindsight. So I think there are three significant dimensions for us to think about around governance of data processing and analysis. The first is the alignment of expectations and capabilities. And capabilities, that's something about the extent to which the people doing the analysis really understand the real world. And it is also something about, that challenging question, will the data actually support this? And I think those are questions that we should always be asking ourselves when we're looking to drive value from data. The second one, that idea of that feedback from the high level view to the detail of the policy, the detail of the technical operations. So do we have a good connection between that high strategic view, that policy view, and the detail of what's happening in the weeds of the algorithms? Because that's where the devil is. That's where the detail is. And the final thought I have around governance of this sort of thing, it's around that idea of technical assurance. We take it as read that every year our financial accounts are crawled over by external auditors, but we don't quite get into the same mindset with our data and our analysis. We've been managing money for 7,000 years, so that quite a mature process. We've had data for far less time than that. So I think this is emerging thinking. This is kind of a relatively new area. So kind of that's I think all I was planning to say now. I would like now to hand over I think to somebody to introduce John.
Yeah, that's me, Andy. Thank you very much for your really interesting presentation. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you John Britton. John Britton is currently a consulting fellow for Halpin Consulting, where he's a consultant in the education, regulatory and local government sectors. He's got a strong academic background in communications, governance and strategy, with significant expertise in data and analysis, and was a former member of the HE Strategic Planners Association Data Institute Insight Group. Personally, I know John well. John has worked in strategic planning in Wales across a number of institutions, and his work at Cardiff University in particular, which I know he'll touch on today, in data governance, I consider to be was massively ahead of its time. I personally value John's expertise and experience in the sector, and he will talk to us more about practical examples from what Andy has told us and how that actually can work in higher education. So with great pleasure, John, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Paula, and thanks, Andy, for a really thought-provoking presentation. And I think it kind of sets me up nicely with this second half now. So I'm going to talk about firstly, some of the challenges we face in practical terms in institutions if we're trying to do institutional research, if we're trying to do analysis and understand our data better. And of course, one of the big challenges, and Andy outlined it very clearly, it's probably upstream. So it's other people who are creating the data, it's other people who are putting the governance around it. It's not necessarily you. You might just want to take it and use it, but you're probably going to have to get involved in those sorts of things if you're going to get the value out of the data, very much as Andy said, in terms of working your way back upstream to make sure that it's good and you understand it. Now, we don't have many institutions with a chief data officer yet, so there tend to be pockets of local data governance and compartmentalized systems and systems that don't talk to each other. So there's a bit of an absence of leadership, and leadership around this is really key. There's also an issue there with ignorance as well, and it's a bit of a blunt word, but a lot of members of senior teams and professional services management teams don't really understand what data is, or that it's all around them, or that they're responsible for loads of data. So even in the last month or two, someone said to me, one of my clients, "Oh, the information governance people do that, don't they? They deal with GDPR." When I was talking about data governance, which of course is much broader, encompassing data quality and how we use our data, the metadata around it, and so forth. So you've probably not got enough resources, because if the challenge isn't understood by the senior team and professional services managers, then they won't necessarily resource it adequately. Also, the issue of burden, and I'm going to touch on that later in the presentation. Andy has in the past, and again, he's refreshed it more recently, done some really interesting thinking around burden, which I'm going to talk about. And finally, skills, which is an issue that I feel really passionate about, and a big challenge for us in the sector, particularly on the professional services side. So if you're in planning, if you're in institutional research, is that our job evaluation frameworks don't value data skills and analysis skills as highly as they could. And part of that is because they're very backward looking. So as Andy said, what we do with data, how we use data science, that's all relatively new. I mean, it's not that new, is it? It's 30 or 40 years, but it's relatively new to institutions that have been around since the medieval monastery or beforehand in a lot of cases, and universities are slow to change. So you've got this big disconnect with the wages that are being paid to, say, data scientists, and it's the same in IT and people with IT skills compared to what we are offering in-house. And you've got to have a battle often with the HR department to get your jobs evaluated at the right level. And that's a real challenge because it's really hard to hire people. So again, I'm going to talk about some practical ways around that also. So if we can roll on to the next slide. So looking at some solutions, how do we manage the lack of governance structures? And the one thing I think you should do first is build informal governance capacity through a coalition. And I've got the picture there of tractor feed. I'm been in the sector a long time as well. And early on in my career, I had the example of, I worked in planning. I went down to the registry and sat with Chris and Ken in the registry, and they printed out some tractor feed, and it was all the students on every program. And we went through it with a pencil and ruler. I went through it and I asked them, well, what's this student doing? What's that student doing? So what's an intercalary year? Why is this a 4-year program? And in doing that in a very informal way, then I learned about all these things, but I understood the metadata around the data. I understood when the data was being produced. I understood what business processes were creating it, and then how it was used further down in operational processes as well. So there's something really there about going and earning your spurs and going and talking, especially for your early career in this area, going and talking to other people in the institution, but also then you're building that allyship as well. And there are people who are interested in data across the institution. So you've got information governance, you've got registry, you've got IT, you've got schools, all of you got a hand on different parts of the data and can benefit from talking to each other. So you get that moral support, you'll learn loads, but also you'll get to understand the data better collectively because you all have pieces of the puzzle. And then you may realize that your institution needs more data governance, but you're just one voice. But if you can collectively then reflect upwards and maybe push that message into different parts of the senior team, you've got much more chance of it landing and much more chance of it happening and it being taken seriously and getting some of the leadership that you need. So if we can roll on to the next slide. So just thinking about senior team engagement, how do you get, so what are the kind of hooks with them? And a lot of the senior teams I work with consultancy, they're not necessarily, they're not data people as such. They come through the ranks in other areas, and even though they're responsible for big data domains in their area, they don't necessarily see it that way, or it's something that IT do. It's not quite realized that data is all around them. So you need things that are kind of direct and visceral and real for them. And I mean, the one obvious one is to avoid a bin fire, because all of your processes are data driven, even if they're on paper. And to give an example of arranging placements for students, I worked with an institution where they had about 15 different schools separately arranging placements. Each was a cottage industry. Some were Excel, some had bought in a system, and some were doing it with an A4 pad. And the outcomes weren't good. And you've got a huge divergence in the student experience then. And you weren't managing it in a sophisticated way because, for example, students then, some had a car, some could travel, some couldn't. They were all being sent to hospitals that were far away from home. So there wasn't the thinking there around, how can we make this a bit more sophisticated with the data that we have? Do we need to collect more data to do this? And then you get a flare up. We did get a flare up in the NSS. Then students were unhappy. Of course they would be. So there are the big ticket risks as well: OFS registration, student recruitment, and ref as well. All of those are big data-driven processes, and if your data goes wrong, they can be existential for the institution. So there is a way of making it real, just bringing it back to the senior team that these things you care about are strongly related. They're underpinned by data. And there are operational risks, just simple things like September arrives and we can't enroll students. If we haven't joined that data set to this other one, then we can't do that. And far too often, and this comes from that ignorance of not understanding the burden of the work, it's the responsibility of one or two people hidden away, tucked away in a corner, and they're not valued, they're not understood, and then they leave, and suddenly there's a minor bin fire that we quickly have to put out. There's also the attraction of efficiency. So better use of data can produce savings, and it can get rid of menial, repetitive work as well. And the institutional reputation. And selling the lodge building, I put in as a reminder to myself, because I did literally work in an institution where we tried to sell a building, and then we realized we didn't own the building. So we could have done with better control of our own data around our estate in that example. So if we can roll forward to the next slide. Just an example of a big bin fire, but this has happened in another is a number of other institutions, and we are talking double-digit £1 million figures in these other institutions. I'm not expecting you to read the whole slide here, but I've put it in just so you'll be able to pick it up and use it later. But it's a certain university tried to implement a new student record system. They went through 3 leaders, several changes in scope. Of course, Data Futures moved on as they were trying to do it, and they spent £30 million on the project and arrived with almost nothing. And the story is pretty grim, really. So as work began, no one had realized that the student record system was connected to so many other legacy systems. I mean, a lot of people in this room would know that straight away, but it is a symptom of that kind of ignorance at that senior team level. So these legacy systems didn't have much documentation. So people hadn't realized beforehand of the scale of the challenge and what was needed to make it work. So they decided to take a different approach, keep the legacy system in place, put a new system in place alongside it, feed data from one to the other, and then use the legacy system to triage connections with the other legacy systems. And okay, that might have worked, except the data model of the two was completely different, because the new student record system was trying to hit the requirements of the new Data Futures system that HEIR were bringing in place. So then the project leader decided to get in more business analysts, and costs snowballed, and it grew and grew and grew, but it became unmanageable, and they never actually realized the outcomes. And that's a bit of an example of the sunk cost fallacy. You're dug in, and you keep digging, and you keep going. So I think, and it's happened in a number of institutions, and I think if you can flag that, informally to your senior teams, and you've got an excellent example with Bloomsbury as well that Andy talked about earlier, where these things are material, they really matter, and your senior team will probably know people who were at this institution and one or two of the others that I'm thinking of. So if we can roll forward again. So another way to raise awareness, and something I've done, is pushed to boards and senior teams really should know this and understand the scope of the systems that are within the institution. That's not very well understood at all. And even just that simple picture with the logos gives you an idea of the complexity. And I'm not going to light the blue touch paper and say to Andy, they probably all got a different definition of a student in each of those systems or returns as well. But also, excellent piece in Wonky last week as well about the number of PSRBs, so the professional regulatory bodies that we report to. So this is an example, that chart with the colours on the bottom right of one institution. They report to about 50 different PSRBs. Now, I know this institution, and I think that list is a little bit short as well, worryingly, but also about 200 programs they're reporting across, and a lot of those different bodies all ask for data in different ways. And again, some of it is emailing an Excel spreadsheet, some of it is you've got a bit more of a secure system that you're joining up to, and so forth, and a data transfer. So it's a hell of a lot of variation, and we all know one of the goals of Data Futures was that you could have a many-to-one approach where these PSRBs would get it from HEIR instead, and we've not quite got there yet. So it's really helpful, I think, to illustrate how much data burden, regulatory burden, data transfers, data curation is going on in the institution, and a very visual example like that is helpful. Plus, of course, there's all the requirements of the OFS, OIA, DQB, and so forth. So I think you've got to tell your senior team this, that all of this is going on and it's their responsibility. Okay, if we can roll on to the next one. I wanted to highlight again, sorry if the graphic is a bit small, but I refer you to Andy's website anyway. I just wanted to raise it now. Andy's done a really interesting bit of work where he's looked at the burden of funding and regulation and all the things you have to do to set up a funding return, make the data processes happen, make the submission happen, make sure it's of adequate quality, reconcile it with other data returns, got the auditors involved as well there, and then generate funding and regulatory metrics. And Andy, I think, came at it from the side of the regulator. It's a really helpful tool for institutions as well, because they've got to be involved in all of these things. You need to be horizon scanning and making yourself aware these returns are coming in, putting in the capability to do it, but also influencing the regulator so that the data tells the story of your institution as well, is as close to the real world as you can make it, so it's realistic. rather than something that is abstracted and unhelpful. Really interesting piece of work on Andy's website about data burden, and I refer you to that. Okay, if I could roll on. So I think we've thought about how we can influence the senior team. Is also, you are likely to be motivated and want to do something yourself as well. And a data professionals network can really help with that. And we're all busy people. So I have talked with lots of institutions about this, and you can't just put aside 3 hours and expect people to turn up once a week or something like that. So you need to think about how you do it. One of the ways we did it at Cardiff, we back in the kind of the old days to a degree, we had a room with PC set up where people could come and work. More latterly, we just had a room, a big kind of conference style room where people could bring their laptops and land. So you can come, you could still do your work, but then there's all the opportunity for those informal chats. And we had data analysts based in our schools. We had people from IT, HR, registry, and so forth. We invited them to come. I got the clearance at the kind of professional services board that people would be allowed to do this. And then people felt that it was okay for them to come there, but they could still get on with their day-to-day work. So it wasn't a distraction as well. And it was really helpful because people would bring their problems and challenges. And it was somewhere where you knew, instead of having the overhead of setting up a meeting, you could just see the people you needed to see and have that conversation. And usually serendipitously, other people would overhear and get drawn into it. And maybe it's helped solve their problem as well, or they're aware of an off-the-shelf solution or something that solves 3/4 of the challenge. So coordination like that, it tackles a number of the weaknesses. So it helps people understand what our data is, because you're facilitating those conversations. It helps people understand what the priorities are, especially you're always going to have a throughput of staff. So there's always learning needed, and there's always change in business requirements as well. But those conversations with the registry and with schools about, well, we don't need this now, but we really need it in a month's time, so we can prioritize that. Then those kind of conversations are really helpful, just for getting everybody feeling like we're working as a team and we're supporting each other rather than acting in little silos across different parts of the institution. It also helps remove duplication. I've already done that report, I've already worked on that, or there's something similar that so-and-so has done, why don't you have a look at that? And it helps us develop common definitions, because it is painful having all of those different definitions of, for example, a student. One of the other things we did in the Data Professionals Network is we would, when we brought people together for an afternoon, during that we would have some presentations, just 20 minutes, 1 or 2 presentations during that afternoon about new regulatory requirements, or the admission cycle that was just starting, or what HR were doing in their area, just to get people up to speed. And a really good way of sharing information and making people who are responsible or knowledgeable about things very visible within the institution then. So I think it's the dream. We can only hope. But if you can get some senior team buy-in, and you get that coalition of the doers as well, then you've got a platform then to develop a meaningful data strategy. And we're not going to talk about that today. That's way too big. But we're talking here about the culture and creating the conditions for doing data well. So I'll move on to the next slide. And culture is really important. So it's kind of the collective behaviors and beliefs of people who value, practice, and encourage the use of data to improve decision making in the institution. And there is something here about institutional research being very much part of that decision making process, but also, of course, we understand that it's used as well in academic research and to influence policy and to influence stuff beyond the wider ambit of an individual institution. But if we can do our data well, it's much more useful for this. So I think do what you can, but be kind to yourself. And it's a difficult one to phrase this, but try with your senior team, try with your colleagues. You probably will get traction. If you don't get traction, maybe you need to think, if are you in the right institution, and be kind to yourself. You can't push a rock uphill all the time. So I think we have to realize some institutions are resistant to this still, but they're becoming increasingly few as the regulatory and the funding screws are being tightened more and more. Of course, it's a university, particularly in a medium-sized or big university. You can't tell people. You've got to bring them with you. So when we had our data professionals network sessions on a Monday afternoon, we made sure we had nice cake there as a way of luring people in, but also it was a friendly environment and a very good environment where people felt comfortable and welcomed into there. And then they open up, and then the conversations happen, and you develop that kind of respect and engagement between people. So you must value their perspectives and views and listen, and make sure it's a listening environment. Academics can be incredibly helpful in this space. So they can advise on methodology, statistics, expertise, computing techniques, but also placements. So a number of times I brought in students for those little jobs where I thought, I'd like to try doing this with data. Don't know how it'll land with other people. I can't really do it as my core capacity, but I brought in a student to try and do something with the data, and they were brilliant, brought so much energy, new visualizations, new techniques that they'd learned on their course, or I could send them back to their academic colleagues who would advise them on methodology, and we bring in new ways of doing things. So there's some opportunities to bring in some new capacity without any cost there. Also talent flow. Of course, I then ended up hiring some of those placements, and it's one of the ways of meeting that challenge of we don't quite pay the full market value for the fully formed data scientist or data analyst or planner. So maybe you've got to bring people through who are raw, but they're bright and they're willing to learn, and it's a different way of doing it. And if you can provide that support around them, if they can still go back and talk to their professors for advice, then their confidence will just grow and grow, and their capability will grow and grow. Hire well, it sounds a bit flippant. I'm going to talk about that in the next page, but also report about what you've done this year to a board level committee. And this is really important. I think we're a long way from this, and it's kind of building on the sort of stuff that Andy talked about. But I'm an economist by background. I also have an arts degree, but down the economics line, I would think, going back 30 years, land, labour, capital and enterprise would be the 4 factors of production. And thinking about that for higher education, it's people, it's finance, it's our data, and it's our buildings, isn't it, as well? Now, data maybe is broader than that. It's more the kind of management knowledge and expertise, data informed decision making. But you've got a HR committee, you've got a finance committee, you'll have a capital projects committee, or it'll be bundled in with finance. Where's the committee that looks at how we do data and regulation? Kind of goes up to the board in an ad hoc way to different committees through different routes. Where's the focus on it? And I think it will come in the future, but at the moment there isn't that board level focus on data. So at least try and find a way to get your report in there. It's much easier at the moment in small institutions. Something that Andy and others have talked about is the regulatory burden is pretty much the same, whether you're a small institution, a large or a medium institution. So the board level people are much closer to the action in small institutions around regulation and data. They see this these days a lot better because the chain is shorter. Okay, if we can roll forward to the next slide. So you are looking for unicorns. It is really difficult. And you've got the kind of lenses there of you want people with good computer science skills, you want people with maths and statistics skills, and you want people who understand the subject matter. You want people who understand universities, student experience, research. Maybe you could look at it a different way. You want people who are good at using data, understand universities, and can talk about data and engage with other people. There's a couple of different ways you can apply lenses to this. And we're not going to be paying top salary in the sector. So these people are very hard to find. So how do you manage that? How do you work ways around that? Well, one thing is your broader network across the institution, but the other is that you, within your team, whatever size it is, you recognize that different people are going to bring those skills to the team. And if you work together and have mutual respect around that, that can work really well. So a diverse team really helps you to do that. Think about what you want from your team. There's some really good work by Nesta about what makes a good data analyst, and that's where some of these lenses would come from. Think about the talent flow, things like placements. Advertise hard, push adverts through your social media, talk through your informal networks, make sure that people are aware when you go out to market. Just really push it and advertise hard. Talk to your academic colleagues. Have they got any good students that would be interested in the posts that you're advertising? Always test practical skills in interview, because that's a really good way of testing what real life is like working in planning or institutional research. You have a problem, you've got to think your way through it. You need to perhaps think quite quickly and under pressure, and you've got to bring those analytical skills and be able then to communicate, ask them about it in the interview then. How did they find the test? How did they pick their way through it? Test outlook at interview as well. You need people who are keen to learn. And you need to have a learning environment then within your team so that there's upskilling and training and people recognize the skills that others have got. And, maybe they're listening to those 20-minute sessions, or maybe they're just going over to talk to other people and pick up and listen. Also, if you're a small institution, see if you can share a good analyst. I'm working with one provider at the moment, and their data analyst works for 2 other institutions, and that works really well because the regulatory burden is held the same by them, so there is an economy of scale in doing that. Okay, if we roll on to the next slide. It's some really good external resources as well. So HEIR have developed a supply side code of practice, and this perhaps is not necessarily for people in this room, because I trust you all to do this. I think you will be honest, impartial, and work with rigor. But it's a teachable thing. It's a way of explaining to other people like heads of professional services and the senior team. These are the expectations from us, from the designated quality body. This is how they expect us to handle data, and they're quite well articulated on the HEIR website. There are also the FAIR principles, that data be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And in the example I gave of the bin fire, clearly that was not the case between the different systems within the institution. So I think that is a question you can ask whenever we're looking at purchasing a new system. Will it create data that meets the FAIR principles? And again, there's a really good website about that articulates those well, and enables you to point at an external resource where it's clear that this is good practice to have good metadata and accessibility and reusability of data, rather than making the same data over and over. Okay, if we roll on to the next slide. So this is my last slide, and it's not a perfect client, but it's an example of a client that was pretty good. So a positive example of a client, the characteristics they had was that there was visible senior team use of data-driven products, and somebody in the performance team was taking data of the senior team that gave insights about how it was a local authority, about how schools' attendances and exclusions were working, and they were using it to inform discussions. So the discussions were starting from a point of knowledge in the senior team, rather than a point of supposition or guesswork, or my experience as a head teacher 15 years ago, or whatever other information people bring into the arena. So there was a culture of openness and support towards innovation in data use by management. People were encouraged to take data and use it and create visualizations and provide insights. There were investment in data engineers and Power BI, and it could be Tableau or whatever, to do that as well. So there was that in tandem with encouragement to widely use the tools. And that was a really interesting example where local authorities have even less budget, less pay to offer for data type people. So the type of people who ended up creating data in Power BI were really experienced people in social services or education, and they then learned data visualization in Power BI as a new set of skills, because they had the really strong domain knowledge, so they knew what they were presenting, and perhaps that was more important than a tool which you can learn, and you can learn quite quickly if there's a support network where you can ask for help when you get stuck around a big organization. So data was already used then to improve services and generate efficiencies within the organization. There was that peer-to-peer sharing of insights and good practice. And the culture, it was accepted. The staff would work in partnership with other organisations outside. So in this case, the police, the ambulance service, to develop common definitions, metadata, think about where they've got a common interest in developing and sharing data. And the institution was lucky to have a mature information governance function. So at least that element was covered off. So when we did want to go and talk to other institutions about data, we knew we were doing it in a correct and safe way. It wasn't a perfect institution. I felt the information governance function could be more out there and be more proactive. There were certainly things that could be changed, but there were a lot of positives, and I thought it was an interesting illustration of what a good culture that was moving forward could look like. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. That's my presentation, and I think we're going to head over to a Q&A now, so I'll hand over back to one of my colleagues.
Thank you so much, John and Andy, for your insight and your presentation. I really enjoyed both of them. It's particularly pertinent, certainly personally, as I kind of transition away from institutional research in my current role, to look at data governance on behalf of our university in a more dedicated way. It's work that I'm certainly looking forward to starting, and both your presentations have given me tremendous food for thought as I start that process. I'd like to invite our participants, if you've got particular questions, pop them in the chat, as they say, or raise your hand. And oh, there, we've got one already. Thank you, Kate. Oh, and another. I'm going to ask Kate, if you don't mind. Oh, you've got your video on. Fantastic. Can I ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, hi, so I'm Kate. I'm doing a part-time doctorate at the business school in Durham, but I'm also working part-time and a fully qualified